Good day, everyone. I'm Rodney Dawson, the host of History Notes, and this is another special edition of History Notes. And I don't want you to think we video every session of History Notes, but when we get the help from our good friends over at the Greensboro Television Network, and they lend a helping hand, we're able to record them. And I'm doing this intro, and I want to make sure I do it right, so I'm going to refer to some of my notes. Normally, I try to commit it to memory, but I want to be accurate with what I say. This summer speakers series that we're doing in collaboration with Mcgirt-Horton Library along with GTN, it started last month, was something that we aired earlier this month for Juneteenth, because I met a black historian, is what they call her, Shirley Simmons. She did a program called Past, Present, and Future, and I learned so much. She's a longtime resident of Greensboro. She came in and talked to us about the history of African-American history in Greensboro, particularly East Greensboro, and it, along with the program the discussion that we have today and the previous one, it begged me to look for why East Greensboro existed, how it happened, and in large part it's due to redlining, which we'll talk about later. But we're filming it here, as I said, at Mcgirt-Horton Library, which lies right within East Greensboro. And as I said, that story that we told last time, and this story is going to talk about redlining, which is a systematic denial or refusal of services through government-sanctioned means. In other words, with the redlining, it was a way that a city, a state, or a federal government could enact laws or ordinances or policies to segregate racially. And so in the South, you had it, but if you go west, if you go Midwest, if you go north, they typically relied on redlining to segregate those neighborhoods. In the South, we had the Jim Crow policies, but we also had redlining as well. And it would later not only keep the races separate as far as residential places, but it would also go a long way towards disproportionately allocating the resources that these pockets of population utilize. And the first district redlining policy took place in Baltimore, Maryland, as a side note. And as I said, we had the Jim Crow policies here in the South before redlining took place. But as early as black men and women emerging after the Civil War, racial segregation as far as residences was in place. And the same case was here in Greensboro. In 1898, we had the Cone brothers, Moses and Caesar Cone, that came here and established the textile industry along with a few others that made Greensboro the denim capital of the world. In doing so, when they were bringing these workers in and attracting a lot of these workers from other parts of the state and other parts of the country, they wanted them to be sustainable. So they had these communities that they would develop, and these communities would have their own school, they would have churches in a lot of cases, they had shops and whatnot, and they would call them mill villages. And there were about 5 in Greensboro, and one of them was designated for African Americans. It was the name of it is the East White Oak Mill Village, and that community is still around today. There's a East White Oak Church as well, and it's about 450 acres back then. It had about over 2,600 workers, and had about 1,500 houses before they were all sold off in the 1940s. And the mills all had a similar look to them. You ever seen those cookie cutter houses? They all had the same type house, but they would have softball fields, recreation, all that type thing. And of course, we had the one that I mentioned, the East White Oak Mill Village. So Sarah Anne Maske, who was a recent graduate from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro Museum Studies program, she worked on an exhibit that chronicled the development and somewhat of the history of the East White Oak Mill Village. And she assisted in that in this public history project called Tightly Woven East White Oak Mill Village. And so if I had a really good throwing arm and a football, I could hit East White Oak from where I am right here at Mcgirt-Horton Library. But rather than do that, let's just enjoy this program with Sarah Anne Maske talking about the East White Oak Mill Village, Tightly Woven.
So I grew up in Richmond County, specifically Ellerbe, North Carolina, and I started looking for colleges and fell in love with UNC Greensboro, and I just kind of stayed here, did my BA in history and archaeology, stayed for my master's in history with the concentration in museum studies, went back home for a little while, and just missed Greensboro. I missed doing research and the museums in the area, and so I decided to come back here. And I was very lucky to get the job at the Greensboro History Museum as the public programs coordinator. So for me, What drove me to really learn about African American history in Greensboro, especially East White Oak, was I love telling stories of those who, while people know their story, it's not very well told, or a lot of people just don't know about it. And just the community ties that I found with Black community centers and places like the historic Magnolia House have really kind of driven my research and to learn more about them. For me, East White Oak, as much as it was telling their story, I grew up as a textile girl. My grandpa grew up in a mill village. My dad still works in a textile mill in Cordova, North Carolina. And it was very much me telling their stories, but taking time to be able to reflect on my family history. And it was so great to be able to work with the East White Oak Community Center, mostly their board. I was able to talk to a couple of community groups in the area, and another really big group that I talked to was the White Oak Legacy Foundation, who are working to really preserve, especially White Oak's history, and kind of the history of heritage genes, and trying to keep that going despite the mills being closed. And I just kind of interacted with people who've already done exhibits. The Fabric of Memory exhibit was done by UNCG in 2016, so I was interacting with some of the historians who worked with that. People at UNC Wilton Library, where the Kahn collection is, and just UNCG archives. Greensboro History Museum, of course, has a lot of the historic photographs, so I was very lucky to work with Elise Allison, our archivist there. So I like to start the history of East White Oak Mill Village is, what is a mill village? Well, Mill Village is kind of like its own little company-sponsored town that has a school, a YMCA, a church, company store, which East White Oak did not have. They actually had a private grocery that was down the road from them. They had their own baseball fields. The Collins specifically had their own dairy where their workers would not get typhoid or any type of diseases from milk that wasn't processed correctly. And these mill villages were a way for communities to grow and mill workers who were moving from rural areas or other parts of the city to really grow in an area, create a community, and really something for East White Oak was getting a great education. I found a quote that kind of sums up their story in the smallest of ways. When Reverend Joseph Duke was asked to describe what it was like growing up in East White Oak, he said, "It's a close-knit community. Everybody knew everybody because we went to school together. We were raised together, and the only things that tore us apart was that war broke out, and everybody went their different ways." We're not really sure when East White Oak started. Most people put the date as 1916 when the school opened, but the plans for East White Oak were much earlier, linking all the way back to the White Oak Mill when it was created in 1905 by the Kahn brothers. Who are the Kahn brothers? So you have Moses and Caesar Kahn. They moved to Greensboro in about 1889, and they decide that they're going to build this kind of chain from the fields to the manufacturer to the buyer. And they create their first mill, a denim factory that was just around the corner from here at Mcgirt-Horton Library. And it was called Proximity because it's proximity to the cotton fields. And Greensboro, of course, was really big because we had the railroads. And so you're able to pull things in quickly from the fields and immediately get them out to places like Chicago or New York, which was amazing for the time period in the industry. They will go on to work with the Sternberger family, which is a Jewish family just like the Collins. They build a flannel company called Revolution, and then of course White Oak would come later. It's the biggest and innovative of its time in 1905, and each one of those mills have their own mill villages. And each one of the mills has their own corporation or companies. So So you have the Proximity Company, the Revolution Company, and the White Oak Company. And they all kind of are under the bigger umbrella of the Collin Mills Corporation, which is very confusing because sometimes the blurred lines of the Collin family themselves and the Collin Mills Corporation, because the Collins stay in power all the way up until after World War II, before they start having others outside the family take over certain aspects. At the turn of the 20th century, the success of the Collin Mills Corporation, especially for the owners, Caesar and Moses Collins, they saw that they were getting lots of black workers into their mills, which means that they needed a community, which unfortunately was segregated at the time, for their black workers. And so in 1905, as part of their White Oak mill construction program, which was innovative for its time period, they added East White Oak, which this was part of some of the planning there. Segregation and anything related to Jim Crow is very interesting when you're looking at mill villages, because everything in the mill village is there. So the children, it was very insular. So the children really didn't go outside of their community. And so when they weren't going outside, if they weren't going to downtown Greensboro or to the other mill villages, they weren't interacting with Jim Crow at all. And they don't really remember it. If you look at the oral histories that were collected by UNCG in 2009, they talk about how safe the community is, how great the community is. But when you start looking outside of that and what historians have looked at for segregation in textile mills, the textile mills were kind of a battleground when it came to politics and to segregation, because it's our #1 industry in the South, especially in North Carolina. So the idea that you can integrate the mills, you'll be able to integrate the rest of the South was really big, especially with the American Friends Committee and a lot of the unions. And it's heavily documented with Collin, because Collin has reaches all the way into the Deep South. They're one of our larger manufacturing companies overall in the US. And so they did interact with it in terms of, were you able to get a good job? Were you able to get a high-paying job or a skilled job? And while Collins integrates really early on in the 1920s, most of the time you do not. You're not able to, because places like South Carolina, they created a law back in 1915 that said no blacks could work within the assembly line because it had to stay segregated. And so you see a lot of people taking on the harder paying jobs as truckers, as boilermen, as openers, or shipping people, or working in the mill villages. For women, most black women were not able to enter into a mill as a worker until the late 1950s. And they would work as domestic servants in the other communities. And this could also be dangerous, because the KKK, as much as the unions were involved in the mills, the KKK were too. And there's documentation that outside of White Oak, the KKK would hand out pamphlets. I found reference to a burning of a cross in East White Oak. And so while it was dangerous, they also kind of had their own little world when they were in their community, because it was safe and they could really interact and talk about politics and build their businesses in a way you really couldn't do in other parts of Greensboro. I'm not really sure in terms of what were the wages exactly, but it really depended on where were you in the mill. And they often were not allowed to have leadership jobs. So black men would have lesser pay than that of a white woman or a white male. And if you were comparing it to the rest of the state, maybe a white child, because there's lots of child labor within the textile mills, especially in the 1910s, as we're starting to get child labor laws. So if you walk into East White Oak Community Center, it's still very much in the bare bones of what it was during when it was a school. You've got three large rooms. These are still active spaces where lots of the community members come in. they rent it, they have their weddings, they have their parties. And so how do you create a space that you're able to tell a story but also allow open floor plan for it to be multi-purpose was really a struggle. And the story itself, there's so much you could talk about and there's so many panels. I mean, I've left maybe 2 out from our presentation today, and it only tells like a drop in the ocean of the stories of East White Oak. So I sat down with the community board and I was like, what do you want to see in this exhibit? What story do you want to tell? And then I went into the research and looked at what historians were saying. I created kind of a script of these are some of the photographs I want to use. This is what I want to say. What do you think about it? And it was a lot of back and forth as I talked to other community groups, my professors at the time, because I was in graduate school. This was my capstone project for UNCG's Museum Studies program. And after a while, this is what we got in the end, but even up until the 2 weeks before, I was still editing things and changing things and finding new information that I really wished I was able to get more of into my exhibit. If you want to see the exhibit, it's still on display at the East White Oak Community Center. So if you're going for a program or anything else, it is there. I was talking with the director, Alice Strike, and they're working on what hours they're going to have. And right now they're also working on a traveling trunk of portions of the exhibit to go out to libraries and schools and other community groups. So there's many chances to be able to see it coming up. Reach out to her, especially if you have something that you really want to do with it or you just want to see it. And if you wanted to see other things about the Mill Village and you do not have access to my exhibit, I highly suggest going to Revolution Mill, to the Fabric of Memory exhibit there, as well as the Greensboro History Museum, because of course in our Voices of the City, we highlight the denim capital, and we tell many of the stories of not only East White Oak, but the other mill villages under the Calm Mills Corporation. So for those who want to uplift a community that's not their own and really make it an American story, just get out there. Don't be afraid to start talking to people. Make sure the people in that community's voices are really being highlighted, that they get a say in what you're doing. But make sure that you're finding connections that everybody have. This idea of a close-knit community, taking care of each other, growing, overcoming adversity are all very much themes of all communities. And if we're looking at East White Oak textiles communities, that's pretty much the turn of the 20th century, especially for the South, especially for North Carolina. Most of your cities were built out of textile communities, or our small towns are textile communities that have been kind of wiped away, that most kids wouldn't realize they're living in. And just really talk to the people around you, bring their stories to the table and say, hey, I heard about this. Have you ever heard this story before? Did you know that this place was part of this history? And just get others excited about it as much as you're excited about it. And be okay with getting out of your comfort zone and being uncomfortable, because being able to tell somebody else's history, especially one that has lots of challenges like segregation that you don't really have a connection to, it's a lot, and it's a lot to process. Be okay with that. Take your time, process it, make sure everything you're doing is really what that community wants, and just enjoy what you're doing. Where can we learn more about tightly woven East White Oak exhibit? Well, join East White Oak Community Center's Facebook group. In terms of East White Oak itself, come by the museum, go by the Fabric of Memory exhibit. One of my favorite books about Black workers in Greensboro. It was kind of the Southeast overall, but they really focus on the Calm family and the Calm Mills, is Hiring the Black Worker by Timothy Machen. And these are really great sources to learn more overall. So check out the Greensboro History Museum website, social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. See more about what I'm doing. Because I'm the public programs coordinator, I'm interacting with all types of amazing work that we're doing there. And just follow us. If you've missed one of our programs, go see our YouTube channels, check out our podcast, and stop by the museum to see our amazing exhibits, especially our new one. And just watch out, we have a lot coming up and a lot of amazing things we're working on.